Hey, George, thanks for joining us. Uh, a bunch of my COM 305 narrative theory students are going to be watching our conversation in your PowerPoint. So thanks for making yourself available to us. It's a really good group of students. By now, they would have done the reading, as I've done, and they'll be viewing this PowerPoint to just kind of fill in the blanks and help them understand the concepts of the paper that you wrote. Anything you want to say before I share my screen?
Well, no, thanks. Really happy to do this.
And with that, this is Dr. George Kamberelis, my friend and a scholar.
So I've been spending a lot of time thinking about stories and the function of stories in kids' lives and in my life as well. Um, and one of the ways I think about it is that life is a narrative. We live narratives, we tell narratives. Narratives kind of primary tool through which we organize and make sense of our lives along the dimensions of time and lived experience. The desire to tell about experience prioritizes the grammatical constructions that young kids learn as like and then, the temporal organization of our lives, which gets embodied in stories. As artists of life, for example, we're engaged in one active creation that occupies all of us, the narrative that is the composition of our lives. Each of us has worked by improvisation, figuring out the shape of our creation, that is our life, rather than pursuing some vision already defined for us. So a vital part of reading stories, of what reading stories offers, requires our emotional participation in the lives, in the worlds of others. Our emotional and imaginative engagement with stories leads us to want to be critical agents of democratic equality. This kind of engagement is thus essential to the process through which stories change the world, what Bruner calls the art of the possible. Readers' imaginations are essential to the process through which stories unravel the real and reveal the possible. So I'm going to let you read this while I talk a little bit about how I got into this and why it's important to me. So my interest, riffing on the work of George Marcus, is what I am calling reading sentimentally. It's a reaction to structural approaches to literature where the first and last move is always ideology critique and the deconstruction of various institutional isms, racism, sexism, and so on. The second thing I'm responding to are Common Core state standards, which you probably suffered through in high school. And with Common Core state standards, narrative stories, whether fictional or non-fictional, have been devalued, whereas informational texts have been privileged. Reading sentimentally, or the way of reading literature that I'm going to encourage in this presentation, requires a consideration of three claims presented in this slide. Bottom line for me is, I want stories to matter. I want them to matter in school. I want them to matter in life. Literature explodes with news about the world, of emotion and feeling. So these are three elements of the prevailing view of emotions and how they function in our lives. I'm motivated by the idea that literature and art generally, filmmaking, for example, or films, for example, explode our sense of self and world. I don't know whether this is news to you. Is it news? It's a question you might want to ask yourself. And if it is, what do we want to do about it? I mean, it's kind of like the blues. How else are you going to understand self and reality without reading with the heart and without reading with the imagination? How are students, in my case, the students I teach, whether in middle school, high school, or college, how are they going to develop the dual dispositions of empathy and critique if their teachers don't ask them to participate imaginatively and emotionally in the lives of the characters of the stories they read?
George, before we go, I don't think it is new to our students,
Okay.
um, except for one thing, which is that you're an educator and you teach educators, and you're talking about literature, and
Yep.
you're talking about the theoretical and then also the personal and emotional. And to me, when I read the article, that was new to me.
Okay.
I think we all know the impact of a play, or a film,
Yeah.
or
Yep.
a social media meme or something like that. But this when it comes to pedagogy and teaching and the art of education and the science of education, to me was kind of new. So I think the students will find, I'm going to assume and hope they find the same kind of newness there.
Oh, makes sense. I'd guess though, and this will be interesting for them to think and talk about, that in school, they were asked to do what is called new criticism, basically develop the same decoding ring that their teacher has, so that they get, understand the author's intent as opposed to responding with imagination and emotion to what's there on the page.
Nice.
And so, yeah, I guess I'm not, that's a good point. And it's not surprising to me. I would hope, though, that it's refreshing for them to break away from that, like Robin Williams did in Dead Poets Society, where he tore out the theoretical introduction to the literary anthology by Leavis, who's a new critic, and said, "The hell with this shit. Let's see how these stories matter in our lives and what they might make us think about, what they might." How they might help us surpass ourselves, become different kinds of people with different dispositions, different sets of emotions, different moral compasses, and so on.
Nice.
So anyway, given this prevailing view, accepting a sentimental view of reading, which, as Jack just suggested, you guys probably already did, requires rethinking the nature and the functions of emotion in connection, and the connections between reason and emotion. And if you think about the first thing I said, one of the things that I think we do is think that sort of critical rational thought precedes emotion and should precede emotion, as opposed to engaging emotionally and imaginatively might give us a different way to think about people, to think about social justice, to think about all kinds of things. So according to Marcus, emotions play an essential role in human understanding, especially understanding the experience of others. This isn't literature, it's art, but in a way, this presentational form can be read discursively. It's basically a piece of art done by the African-American artist Romare Bearden in the 1950s. And when you have a chance, maybe with some friends or maybe people in this class, I suggest that you sort of think about how might you engage with this piece of art. As I look at it, all kinds of emotions are evoked in me. I feel pain, I feel struggle, I feel a sense of the downtrodden, I feel a sense of inequality. And it's only later that I start to think about the social and political sort of context in which all of those emotions that I just talked about might occur, and what institutional systems might create ways of life, like represented in this piece of art, that would lead to those emotions. And having experienced this piece emotionally, I think I have a better sense of what I'd like to change in the world, or like to see changed in the world. What are your thoughts and feelings? Again, maybe you want to talk with some friends or family members or people in class about this. Riffing a little bit more on these ideas, with this African-American artist, we witness how emotions are the connective tissue of people's lives, how human feeling is a passageway, how it redraws where I begin or we begin, or where I end and we end. Bearden's work furnishes an entry into dramas, perspectives, existences that are not our own, but can become our own. His art challenges our assumptions about self-enclosure. We're drawn into the emotional lives of others, specifically the others represented in this piece of art. Ourselves and our lives blur and become entangled with those of others. Bearden's work shows us how affective pathways are modes of travel, if you will, toward the worlds of others, and thus also toward our own possible selves and our own possible worlds and our possible futures. Futures in which we might think, we might feel, and we might act in ways different from how we act now. I'm going to switch gears a little bit here and talk about a piece of art created by a student that some of my colleagues and I worked with. And this is a piece of art she created. It's a drawing of Melinda, the main character in a young adult novel called Speak. Some of you may have read this novel. Melinda is raped by another high school student in this novel. And reading sentimentally was the means through which this student started to understand, to connect with, to travel to the character of Melinda. In doing so, she created new ways of understanding her own experiences and living with others and through others. Equipment for living, if you will, a new moral compass, a different way to imagine and later enact reality. So the second element, I think, of thinking about literature and what we might get from literature in the ways that I'm talking about, that is reading sentimentally, has to do with the literary imagination. And here's a quotation from Martha Nussbaum, who has spent a lot of time thinking about these things. The man in the moon, the cow with the crumpled horn, the little star. In all these cases, the child fancies that a form which perception presents to it as a simple physical object has a complex inner life. To see moon craters as a face, to speak to a star, to tell a story about a cow. These are things that the factual detached imagination of economic science is unwilling to do. But there is, as the novel says, a charity in this willingness to go beyond the evidence. And this charity is a preparation for the greater charities of life. I'd like you to think about one clause in this little quotation. A charity in this willingness to go beyond the evidence. What does that mean? What might happen to us if we were to do that? So last but not least, the third element of reading sentimentally, if you will, is the art of the possible. As readers of stories, we're often provided with events that ask us to negotiate what was initially expected with what eventually transpired. The story reading process involves negotiating the mixed comforts of the customary with the temptations of the possible. In the literature classroom, and again, all of these ideas came from working with middle school kids in English classrooms in ways a little bit different from what I think typically happens in school. In the literature classroom, we provide students with practice or instruction in how to see beyond what is given, what is accepted, what is expected. Jerome Bruner talks about the art of the possible in this way. For it's not just who and what we are that we want to get straight, but who and what we might have been, given the constraints that memory and culture impose on us, constraints of which we are often unaware. So I'm going to talk a little bit about a novel that a number of people have talked about. And I'm going to talk about it because I think it gives a sense of how reading stories can incite the imagination, can activate emotional responses that actually can lead to changing the world. In a book review of this book by Jose Rizal, which is a second novel called, I can never say this word, Il Filibusterismo, a couple of reviewers, Campano and Guiso, it's not important that you know them, revisited the imaginative impact of Rizal's novel, noting that it went beyond simply commenting on the dishonesty of the friars and the imperial rule in the Philippines. They argued rather that Rizal's work engaged the collective Philippine imagination by gesturing toward an alternative world without Spanish domination. This novel, they claimed, helped imagine into existence an ideal of Philippine nationhood, which subsequently ignited the anti-colonial aspirations of younger generations of Filipinos and eventually led to national sovereignty. Not the least bit unimportant, very powerful, in fact. Stories, this particular novel, changed the Philippines from a colony to a nation. So I'm now going to talk a little bit about some work we did with a teacher named Jeff in a middle, actually it was a middle school teacher. I say elementary here, but it was actually middle school. And how he set up the kind of reading that I'm talking about, reading sentimentally with his middle school students. and also a little bit about how they took up his invitations and opportunities. When Jeff gathered kids around in a kind of literature discussion circle on a rug, he almost, with a new book, he almost always started this way. If you are a dreamer, come in. If you are a dreamer, a wisher, a lair. If you are a hoper, a prayer, a magic mean buyer. If you are a pretender, come sit by my fire. For we have some flax golden tales to spin. Come in, come in. Now, I'm not really sure about your experience, but in mine and most of the classrooms I spend time in, this kind of invitation is pretty uncommon. What's more common is the new critical way of thinking about literature, which is, okay, let's find the real meaning of this thing. I have the decoding ring. I'd be generous enough to give it to you if you want to pay attention. And if you're kind of willing to do the hard work it takes to learn to do literary criticism, to learn about symbolism, about characterization, about all kinds of literary tropes, absolutely required if you're really going to understand what this novel is about. Jeff's invitation is different. Jeff's invitation is, let's experience these tales. Let's see if we can imaginatively participate in the characters' lives. Let's see what they mean about our own life. Let's see if maybe they give us some ideas about how to live our lives differently. Here's how he explained why he uses this invocation. It's a kind of ceremony that lets kids know we're moving into something different and special. It sets the mood. I don't know, it's like you gotta say the blessing before you eat. It helps us know we're about to do something special, to take part in a special kind of sharing and trusting when we read and tell stories together. And then he told a story about his way of engaging in reading and where it came from. So I got a story about myself that I like to remember, because one of the things I think about stories like this is that you remember them for a reason, or your parents remember them for a reason. You might think about that. Sometimes maybe it's just because they're funny. But usually if you listen to people tell these stories, it says something about you as a person, right? When you think about it, even when you were 1 or 2, 3 maybe, things were happening to you. And you can probably think about that and say, well, yeah, that's kind of like how I am. The stories that people tell about us and the stories that we tell ourselves, especially in family contexts, define in many ways who we are. They set sort of parameters or enablements and constraints about who we can be. Think about that for yourself. Some of the stories told about me by my family, I'm pretty happy with and I think represent me. Other ones I think are way off because I've grown far beyond my parents, who aren't alive anymore, but when they were alive, far beyond their understanding of who I am. And here's the story Jeff told about himself and his reading. So I'll tell you what it reminded me of was this place. The way he described the place, and Jeff is talking about a story that they read together. The way he described the place reminded me of being in the woods in Virginia when I was probably the age of the kids in this book, and seeing turtles, and there was a little creek down there. But I like the way he said, you can take a place into your soul, because that's kind of how it feels to me, even though, like now, when I go back there are houses built on it, but I still feel like I carry that place around in me. I think that's what he meant by that. I don't know. Anybody else? And then he let kids share their sense of what they thought about when they read this part of the story. Now I want to talk a little bit about the art of the possible, imagining and projecting ourselves into possible worlds and possible selves, around a book called To Hell with Dying by Alice Walker. You may or may not know this book. It's a beautiful book, a very powerful book. I'll give you sort of a synopsis of it along the way, but I'd encourage you to get it from the library or get it on Amazon or find it somewhere on the internet and read it. So this is a story about an older African-American man and his relationship with a family and their children. Turns out it's Alice Walker, her brothers and sisters in her family. and it's partially autobiographical. Over the course of the story, Mr. Sweet, the man you see in the illustration here, regularly goes to bed and just stays there. We're never told why directly, but it seems related to a kind of depression that happens from being downtrodden again and again and again for being a Black man in the 30s and 40s in the Deep South. When this does happen to him, when he has this inclination to go to bed, the children, Alice Walker and her brothers and sisters, are the only ones who can, in quotation marks, bring him back from the brink. So time and time again, they're called to his bedside as their father proclaims, "To hell with dying old man. These children need Mr. Sweet." At that point, they crawl under the bed with him. They hold his face in their hands. They breathe very close to him, and they bring him back from the brink. This happens time and time again in their lives in this story. As the story unfolds, we learn a little bit more about Mr. Sweet's life. We witness the genesis of his life, in fact. Growing up in the South as an African-American man with dreams that he can never fulfill. How his hopes are dashed, how his dreams are deferred, but usually actually shattered. We see his life from within, the complex significances within which he's invested his life, what matters to him. His guitar playing, his love of fishing, the love of his life forever lost, his dreams pretty much all deferred, and his turn to drink, as they call it. He's rendered as a cultural and racial stereotype. And as you read the book, it's as if that's just how it is. Nothing more, nothing less. But then this reality, this stereotypical reality, the expected, the canonical, is troubled. We learn that his drunkenness makes him a really wonderful playmate. He loves Alice. He's kind. He's forgiving. He makes her feel beautiful. He makes her feel smart. He helps her love herself and grow up strong. She ends up feeling powerful and very important. Years later, when Alice is a PhD candidate about to defend her dissertation at Harvard, she gets a call from her mom and dad that she has to come home and come to Mr. Sweet's bedside. She does. She finds, however, that she no longer has the power to revive him as she once did. She can't bring him back from the brink. She looks away as he lay there. And when she looks back, his eyes are closed. His breathing has stopped. So here are some middle schoolers' response to having read this book with Jeff. I'll let you read them later. But recall, these are young kids. These are 11, 12-year-old kids. And having read this book sentimentally, because Jeff allowed them to, here are some of the things they say. So let's get kind of sum things up here. The canonical, the possible, and the critical. So the canonical is life as we think it has to be, what seems normal and natural to us. The possible is what might be, but we haven't thought about yet. And the critical is what we might do in the world once we have some sense of what might be possible. Stories, or the story, invites a reconsideration, perhaps even a refutation of the canonical. A Black man who moves from job to job, plays the guitar, fishes, chews tobacco, drinks a lot, and so on. It gestures toward an alternative world, or toward a way of seeing and understanding Mr. Sweet that culture and history haven't made visible. Reading with emotion and imagination allows us to see Mr. Sweet as gentle, as kind, as loving, and as trustworthy, which, in the community he grew up was an issue, which is indeed how Alice and her family saw him, but not the community at large. Reading with emotion and imagination also moves us to think about the complex historical and social factors that constituted the conditions of possibility within which Mr. Sweet could or could not fashion a life, as well as what his life might have been like given different conditions of possibility. So some final thoughts. Sentimental ways of engaging literature are, in fact, I believe, necessarily linked to the outcomes of social political understanding, so often identified with critical theoretical approaches to reading. And again, if you go back to what I said in the beginning, I think there's a tendency now to jump to the critical without really even experiencing, imaginatively participating, if you will, in the lives and worlds of the characters in the stories we read. In other words, I believe that the emotional and imaginative participation of readers in the worlds of others is a necessary first step toward developing forms of critique and social action that have real political teeth. In this regard, French philosopher and theologian Blaise Pascal seemed to be onto this many, many centuries ago when he said, "The heart has its reasons, the mind knows not of." Food for thought. What do you guys think? Thanks so much, Jack. I really appreciate it. I hope your students enjoy the article and the setup here. Again, and I really appreciate you using your technological prowess against my technological naivete to make this happen.
No problem, George. Thank you. I found the article interesting and fascinating, and then for the students to get to hear your thoughts and some examples of what what you wrote about in the article in this YouTube video that I'm going to post is awesome. So thank you so much. I'll say goodbye for now.
Sounds great.
And, maybe I'll share some of the discussion posts with you later on if the students will give me their permission to do that.
I'd love to. I'd love to see what they think.
All right, friend. We'll talk soon.
Sounds good. Bye-bye.
Bye.